Another week of the pandemic, another week in tech, and who better to talk to about developments than my old friend Keith Teare. Keith, this week you are headlining the question, is software eating work? Or maybe we should rephrase that, has software finally eaten work? Because it's always been eating work. So what's been going on when it comes to software and work on the dining table this week?
Well, you know, in this week's Venture Trends newsletter, there's a whole bunch of people writing about the trend towards remote work. Last week, if you'll remember, Twitter, Facebook, and others went, Box, all said they're going to move towards remote work. This week is the backlash. So in the newsletter, we've got Sundar Pichai from Google saying they are not planning to move fully remote. They want to keep up with the office. We've got Om Malik on his blog talking about remote work being a method whereby employers push costs onto employees, thus reducing the need for central facilities and so on. We've got Oren Hoffman saying that remote work is going to equal less work and less employees. And then David Cummings talking about how it's going to be real hard to get your boss to give you a promotion when you work remotely, because your boss is never going to see you and you won't be able to do all those things you need to do to get a promotion.
I know all these people except, you said David Cummings. Is he related to Dominic Cummings?
I don't believe so, but...
Who is he?
Fine.
Who's David Cummings?
He writes for a Medium publication called Startup, and he's a prolific writer. That's all I know about him.
And then the company you did, TechCrunch, is also getting into the business of remote work. Yeah,
TechCrunch Disrupt is going to be virtual this year. The title I use in the newsletter is The End of TechCrunch Disrupt, ? Because really, you can't bring the value that TechCrunch Disrupt represents as easily remotely as you can physically. So it really isn't the same entity anymore, and it probably won't get the same revenue. So what's really going on here is out of necessity, software is the glue between people in the absence of physicality. And that can lead to less people, lower paid people. Facebook has gone on the record to say it's going to pay people less outside of Silicon Valley than inside. So less people, lower paid people, less promoted people, but much more efficient and improved technology and processes.
Two questions on this, Keith. Firstly, was some of the early stuff misreported? Did Twitter isn't closing its San Francisco office? Is it actually saying that no one ever needs to go to the office again? Or is it suggesting that in the future you won't have to come to the office every day, which is quite different from just shutting their physical office down?
The actual decision was you can work from wherever you want. Now,
but what does that mean? I mean, every day or just occasionally?
It's interesting. My venture fund, ADV, has been remote from day one. Does that mean we never meet together? No. We have offsites twice a year. We have all hands meetings every now and then. But we actually don't have an office. We rent a house in London, which is big enough to host meetings. And most of our stuff is virtual. And I think that's what Twitter is. Twitter actually is quite literal. I think that's what it's saying. It's been quite a week for Twitter, of course, because they also started putting fact check links on Donald Trump's tweets, which was interesting.
We'll get to that later. That's a really, really important and interesting subject. But my other question is a little bit more local and perhaps self-interested. What's going to be the impact of this on San Francisco real estate? Some people have suggested that this is the opportunity now for everyone to leave San Francisco, since we all hate it and it's full of homeless people and beggars.
Yeah, I didn't actually bring that into the newsletter much this week because it was in last week. However, there's been a ton of stuff about that this week, led by Cyan Bannister, who's a well-known capitalist, talking about how degraded life is in San Francisco around the Battery district.
Yeah, I had a brief exchange with her and Mike Arrington on Twitter, in which I said to her, well, I don't know how bad things are around the Battery, but my girlfriend lives just above Haight, and the area around there is really like a massive refugee camp. It's astonishing, shocking. Really, dystopia has arrived. There's no more science fiction now, I don't think.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's all a matter of degree, but San Francisco has been disgusting in that way for quite some time. And it really, as you and I are both British, we anticipate that society has a safety net that means that that is difficult to happen. Although that said, London has its fair share of it. There's way less of a safety net here. And therefore, when somebody does get into trouble, including mental health, physical health, lack of money, there really isn't anything except living on the streets. And that is America, by the way. That I don't think that has anything to do with Silicon Valley, and it has.
Do you think it's going to drive VCs out of San Francisco? There must be a lot of VCs with their home base in San Francisco itself.
VCs are stubborn individuals, so I suspect that all those investments they have in multi-year tenancy agreements are around the square. What's that square called where South Park was made? Is it South Park, probably?
Yeah.
You know, they all have offices around the South Park neighborhood, multi-year leases. You know, they've been there a few years. I doubt they're leaving anytime soon. However, their business is becoming more and more virtualized, and pitches are less and less face-to-face. And the logic of having that office is declining. And I don't think companies will move out of the Valley. I think employees might.
You remember a few months ago, there was a big fight between Mark Benioff and Jack Dorsey. I think Benioff claiming that Dorsey was not really committed to San Francisco enough. Do you think, you know, and when you go downtown in San Francisco, it seems increasingly like a Salesforce.com town, like Detroit was a Ford town. Do you think even Benioff is beginning to regret his commitment to San Francisco?
I would strongly doubt that, Andrew. Benioff has over the years built relationships that led to the decision to build Salesforce Tower, which included, by the way, various payroll tax credits or discounts. I think he's a man of some, you know, he sticks to his word, and I believe he has agreements that he will stick to, and I think he believes in it. I do think, however, Salesforce will become more and more distributed, and more of the floors in the Salesforce Tower he'll seek to be a landlord rather than having his employees in them as things progress.
San Francisco needs a Rudy Giuliani, or at least version 1.0 of Giuliani, pre-Trump Giuliani. Maybe Benioff one day will be that figure. They certainly need someone of a stronger political constitution than the current mayor. Anyway, Keith, let's move on with the newsletter. You were generous enough also to give a link to something I wrote this week.
Yeah, you know, I thought it actually fit very well into the theme of the newsletter. So I wasn't doing any favors to you. It actually belongs there. You wrote about Mark Andreessen's Software's Eating the World statement from some years ago, and you gave a lot of context to the meaning of that as it's evolved. And you focused in particular on, as that happens, the technocrats become more and more powerful. As we've seen this week with Facebook and Twitter having a standoff, Zuckerberg versus Dorsey, on whether to interfere with Donald Trump's tweets, for example.
And I'm strongly in the Dorsey camp now. I don't know about you.
I am not really in the Dorsey camp, so we could have a good discussion about that.
No, yeah, let's move on. But yeah, finish my piece was part of a series about how the pandemic is changing the world for the very popular book website lithub.com.
Yeah. So you know, your piece was very much part of your writing over the years has always focused on some of the negative consequences of progress. And I felt as a reader, and tell me if this is what you intended, that you focused on the techno elite getting more and more power as software becomes more and more pervasive. Of course, there's lots of good trends that come from software becoming pervasive as well. But, you know, give it, in your own words, how are you reading that?
Well, the software eating the world, of course, was the subject of the title of a very famous essay by Mark Andreessen in 2011. Andreessen, I don't need to tell your audience, being probably the preeminent venture capitalist, not only in Silicon Valley, but in the world. Anyway, Andreessen wrote his famous essay about software eating the world in 2011. My argument in my essay is that 9 years later, he said it would happen in the next 10 years. It actually happened in 9 years. He didn't, of course, predict the pandemic. And whilst a lot of this was predictable, I mean, always require an Andreessen to do so, although he's more prescient, I think, than many others. He's able to kind of wrap this all in a very intelligent framework. What I'm fearful about, and this also connects with Andreessen's latest essay about why we need to build, or let's build, which he came out with earlier this year during the pandemic, is that I think the crisis and the shift in the economy has lent itself and the sort of dysfunctionality both of the American state and of American political life has lent itself increasingly to a technocracy. So when Andreessen says we need to build now in America, he says, let's become like Singapore. Now, of course, and this comes back to our conversation about San Francisco, Singapore is the antithesis of San Francisco. There are no homeless. There are no filthy streets. Everything's organized. It's an incredibly pleasant place to be and perhaps live. But of course, there's one thing that even San Francisco has now, which Singapore doesn't have, which is democracy. Singapore is a sort of soft autocracy, a one-party state, whereas San Francisco and America still remains barely perhaps a democracy. So my essay is a warning that if we fall into the technocracy trap, which I think is the way in which people like Andreessen and perhaps Dorsey and Bezos naturally think, then we are endangering democracy. But I hope everyone will, you know, most of your audience won't naturally go to lithub.com. It's a great site, and the essay's on that.
That said,
of course, what I'm trying to do, Keith, here, and this is a good segue to your next section in the newsletter, is, as every writer, I want to be an influencer. I want people to see my ideas, read my books, watch my podcasts. One of the sections in your newsletter this week focuses on what you call the rise of the influencer, but I would rewrite it as the rise and rise and rise of the influencer. What's happened this week to make influencers even more influential?
Well, the first thing is, for readers of the newsletter, I just changed that headline. So you're going to look like you didn't read it, because I'm going to use your one.
I hope it's rise and rise and rise. 3 rises.
Yours is a better one. Well, a lot happened this week. We talked last week about Clubhouse, which is a place where individuals meet in rooms organized by an individual. We talked this week, Instagram announced that they are now going to be paying influencers in 2 different ways. The first is influencers are going to be allowed to ask for money on their live streams on Instagram. And then secondly, Instagram's IGTV ads, the revenue is going to be shared with the influencer.
So they're kind of stealing the Patreon model, are they? Or combining Patreon and Facebook?
They're combining Patreon and Google in a way, Google Ads. Then the other part of the influencer trend is in this week's newsletter is there's a great article about the rise of TikTok, written by somebody who knows the true story. And then finally, the New York Times, which was really the catalyst for the section, wrote a long piece about you're only famous. The people who are famous are only famous to you, which is all about the audience for any particular influencer are the people who see that influencer as being famous, but in the broader world, they're not famous. And this is particularly true on TikTok and on YouTube, on Instagram. Everyone now has an audience and is finding ways to monetize that audience. And through that often is finding ways not to need to have a paid job with an employer. And this seems to be a pretty baked in trend now and would align very well with the trend towards remote working or the end of work.
Yeah. Is this sort of more and more evidence of the winner take all economy? We saw this deal, I think it was this week, with a very prominent podcaster, so prominent, I can't remember his name, and Netflix. Was it Spotify. What's the guy's name? You know, Rogan, Joe Rogan.
Dan somebody. I know you.
Joe Rogan.
Yeah, Joe Rogan. And
$100 million deal. I've read a lot of criticism that this just reflects, again, a winner-take-all economy. You remember, I've been involved in this debate for years. People used to say, oh, the internet's going to democratize, and it hasn't. All it did was created a tiny handful of mega stars, and then this class of people who earn nothing and nothing in between, the disappearance of a kind of digital middle class, which I would bet heavily will happen also in this new rise of the influencer and Instagram and all that sort of thing.
You know, I think something new is happening there. Steve Gilmore talks about this a lot. He has this concept called micro communities. And given the tool sets that are out there for being an influencer and having an audience and plugging into the audience, I mean, in a way, I'm doing that with this video and the newsletter. The tools that are out there now are quite amazing. Your now.tv. Imagine how long ago would you have to go back that it would be impossible to even conceive of?
No, I get all that argument. I understand that. But as we develop now.tv, if it's a success, I guarantee you there'll be a tiny group of winners. The biggest challenge, this comes back to my essay as well, is that the pie isn't being shared. And every new step in the digital economy suggests more democratization, but actually that's not the case. So for example, people like Don Tapscott argue, I interviewed him for my Keenon show, that blockchain is going to democratize. I know you have a section in the newsletter on blockchain and crypto, and I'm sure some interesting stuff's been happening this week, but I don't see any evidence of blockchain or crypto democratizing finance, do you?
It is actually beginning to happen. This week there was two 401k plans that enable you to buy Bitcoin for your 401k announced, for example.
But why does that democratize? All it means is that the owners of crypto or Bitcoin or whoever owns the platform get richer. There's nothing democratic about that.
The democratization element is a bit futuristic, so bear with me for a second. You'll be skeptical, but I think there's a rationality here. The EMI made an announcement this week that it's going to use a blockchain token to reward fans as well as artists. And they're going to do that by giving tokens to fans who share music with their friends. In other words, the fans are becoming the distribution company. And EMI, along with the artist, is the publisher, but not so much the distributor. And blockchain and tokens are being used, A, to validate what somebody did, B, get them paid in some kind of a currency. I think there's something in that. You know, when you share a New York Times article with 1,000 followers on Twitter, my guess is the New York Times would probably willingly credit you with some kind of a reward for that effort on their behalf. But the infrastructure for doing that just isn't there. Blockchain and tokens represent a really quite interesting way to build those economic systems. And I do think you're right. There will be big winners, but there'll also be small winners. And I think the small winners will be able to do quite well out of it if we can do that.
You may be right. I hope you're right. We talked about Mark Andreessen earlier. He now, in last week, has shown more interest in crypto. If they're going to be winners, he's not going to be a small winner. He'll be a big winner, won't he?
Mark is very ahead of the curve. And, you know, to give credit where credit's due, it's really Chris Dixon, who runs the crypto fund at Andreessen, who is a former entrepreneur and angel investor who Mark cleverly talent hunted and brought into Andreessen. Chris is leading those efforts. They've raised a $300 million, then a $500 million fund. And this week there's an article interviewing Chris in Forbes where he makes the point that whereas other venture capitalists have kind of fallen away a little bit from investing in crypto, Andreessen is doubling down because it believes the next layer of infrastructure for the entire planet is being laid down. An infrastructure inherently global and digitizes money and value. And this week, Libra, the Facebook initiative in this space, announced that they've renamed their wallet from Calibra to Novi, N-O-V-I, and there is talk of them possibly getting as much as $3 trillion of value in those wallets. They launch it. And having a payment mechanism that everyone can use globally. So I do think there's very significant things happening. It's just a little bit like in 1994 when I started the first internet service provider in Europe. Everyone said, what's the internet? I remember Maurice Sarchi coming into Siberia, the cyber cafe that we opened alongside our ISP, so we could show him what the internet was. Along with Mick Jagger, by the way, and Sinead O'Connor. They had no clue. Well, Bitcoin and blockchain and other currencies, they're a bit in that stage now where it's alien to most people. But if Andreessen is doubling down, you should assume there's a valid future there.
I agree. And as I said earlier, I interviewed Don Tapscott, who's probably the world's leading authority or thinker on blockchain. Who talks about it as the new internet for my Keen On podcast. It's a really good conversation. And I think one of the reasons why Bitcoin, blockchain is the new internet now is because in the post-pandemic world, veracity is critical. And the need to establish ID passports are going to be built on blockchain platforms. And I'm sure we'll, as this show unfolds, we'll be talking many more times about blockchain as the new internet. Finally, Keith, let's have it out on this Jack Dorsey versus Mark Zuckerberg debate. As everyone knows, Dorsey, quote unquote, censored Trump on Facebook, had a connection to one of his tweets about correcting Trump's remark about voting in person online. Zuckerberg then, I think, in very bad taste, really disturbingly bad taste, came on and said something like, well, you know, I'm not in Dorsey's camp. I'm strongly in Dorsey's camp. I think there's a real need for this, and I think it's going to change everything. Why are you sympathetic to Zuckerberg?
Well, I mean, by way of context, I remember I ran an internet service provider. I was the chief technology officer. And in those days...
Yeah, but that was like 30 years ago.
Yeah, but the police at that time and the government tried very hard to get us to regulate the content that our users were viewing or publishing on the service. And it's a slippery slope. I mean, don't get me wrong. I want Trump to lose the election, and I want Dorsey to do everything he can to help Trump lose the election. I just think that as an operator,
but that's got nothing to do with it. Whether or not you want Trump to win the election has nothing to do with Dorsey's decision and Zuckerberg's critique of Dorsey.
Well, I was about to get there. It's really to do with who takes responsibility for facts. And, you know, clearly facts matter. And clearly Trump is not factual in what he's saying. So there's no dispute that Trump is not factual and that facts matter and that fact checking is a very, very valuable thing. All tick, tick, tick. Is Twitter the appropriate organization to build features to determine when something gets fact checked and when it doesn't? I personally think it's a little bit paternalistic and assumes that the human race are like children and we need to be protected. The truth is, everyone knows Trump isn't factual and everybody will fact check him.
Well, not everybody. The people who support Trump certainly don't. They think he's telling the truth.
The people who support Trump are immune in most ways. So it doesn't matter what you do, they're going to support Trump. But the fact is, people are very good at fact checking and the truth will be out. And there's no real need in a public square to have the person with the microphone being the arbiter of whether something is factual or not. They don't need to do that. They're overstepping what I personally expect of them. I strongly disagree with Kara Swisher on this.
Yeah, I have to say, as usual, I'm usually in Kara's camp. I disagree with you. It's probably the subject of a longer conversation. But finally, on the VC money front, do you think that Trump's reaction and all this saber rattling about doing away with safe harbor, is that going to have any impact on the VC world? I mean, no one's investing, I guess, in social networks anymore. But do you think it could translate into a financial run on these social networks, on Twitter and Facebook and the rest?
You know, I seriously doubt it, but it's not impossible. It depends how far it goes and how effective it can be, which I suspect will be not very far and not very effective. But, you know, who knows? We watch this space. I do think that VCs, you know, have to make decisions with money based on the likelihood of outcomes. And so should it be the case that Trump is successful, yes, it will affect VCs.